They say evil hides in the shadows, but in 1870s Nevada, evil wore perfume, smiled sweetly, and offered you a job. The Everhart Sisters weren't just madams. They weren't just murderers. They were architects of psychological entrapment, operating not in chaos, but in perfect, chilling order. And they didn't choose their victims at random. They studied them, manipulated them, broke them. This isn't folklore. This isn't the invention of wild-eyed storytellers in desert saloons. These women existed, and their crimes, buried for over a century, are only now being peeled from the soil, bone by bone, name by name. It began with a sealed report. In 1887, railroad workers unearthed 97 skeletons, female only, beneath the foundation of the Golden Rose Saloon. Their bodies bore identical trauma, incisions in the same places, signs of restraint, identical post-mortem handling. The investigators who examined the scene, 3 of them transferred within weeks, citing psychological disturbance. The files were sealed. Whispers died in dark corners. No one wanted to talk about what they saw in Silver Creek, because no one wanted to admit how long these women had been disappearing and how no one did a damn thing. Behind the walls of the Golden Rose, the Everhart Sisters didn't just run a brothel, they ran an institution of control. Their power didn't come from knives or poison, it came from strategy, from data, from profiling. They recruited women with surgical precision, immigrants, orphans, the displaced, the desperate. They used the illusion of respectability to cloak their operation in sanctified silence, and when their victims vanished, letters were forged, wages were paid in absentia. The sisters' stories never wavered. The town believed them because it wanted to. This is not just a story of murder, it's a story of how society protects evil when it dresses itself in civility. And this is only the beginning. They didn't come from nowhere. The Everhart Sisters didn't just appear in Silver Creek as if conjured from smoke and charm. No, this was orchestrated, calculated, traced all the way back to Philadelphia, where the 4 sisters were born into a family with a legacy as cold and methodical as the crimes they would later commit. Their father, Alaric Everhart, was a physician-turned-pathologist. Known not for his bedside manner but for his morbid obsession with anatomical experimentation, he was quietly dismissed from the Pennsylvania Medical Institute in 1857. Officially, it was due to inappropriate cadaver acquisition. Unofficially, he was rumored to have operated on the living, not just the dead. Their mother, Lisette Dumarc, descended from French aristocracy, fleeing the political executions of 1830s Lyon. Elegant, cold, a master manipulator in high society, her reputation among Philadelphia's elite was that of a woman who could orchestrate a dinner party, a blackmail scandal, or a public suicide with equal poise. From this unholy union, Greta, Wilhelmina, Margot, and Adelaide were not raised, they were engineered. Their early education wasn't reading and arithmetic, it was rhetoric, deception, social climbing, and emotional camouflage. Greta, the eldest, studied rhetoric and law under her father's former colleagues. Wilhelmina learned bookkeeping and cryptography. Margot mastered the art of social infiltration, while Adelaide, perhaps the most dangerous, learned to mimic innocence so convincingly she could make a priest confess. But it wasn't just intellectual conditioning. At ages 10 through 15, the sisters were subjected to their father's private psychological training experiments. Forced silence, isolation, strategic betrayal. Greta was locked in a dark cellar for 3 days and told her sisters were dead. Margot was ordered to earn the trust of a maid and to destroy her reputation with planted letters. Adelaide was tasked with faking an illness so convincingly that a real doctor prescribed opium. This wasn't education, it was indoctrination into domination. When Alaric died in 1869 under mysterious circumstances, his throat slit during what officials called a robbery gone wrong, no items were taken, but his private journals were missing. Journals rumored to contain decades of notes on behavioral control, fear manipulation, and obedience engineering. And within 6 months, the Everhart Sisters vanished from Philadelphia. The next time their names appeared was on a dusty ledger in Silver Creek, Nevada, where they paid a full year's rent in cash. Silver Creek never stood a chance. By the time the Everhart sisters arrived, the town was already infected. Not with disease, but with opportunity. Thousands of men stacked like tinder in a powder keg of silver, sweat and sin. The desert didn't just isolate them, it erased accountability. Law enforcement, days away. Communications, controlled by a single postmaster with no questions and fewer answers. The perfect terrain for predators. They didn't come in as strangers, they came in like royalty. Greta handed the banker a sealed letter from a prominent Carson City judge, later discovered to be forged with such precision that it fooled handwriting analysts nearly a century later. The letter claimed the sisters were daughters of a recently deceased Eastern investor. He had left them a sizable inheritance and recommended they invest in the hospitality opportunities of the Nevada frontier. Clean, respectable, virtuous. No one questioned it. The banker smiled. The mayor tipped his hat. The women of Silver Creek, though few in number, welcomed them with cautious optimism. The sisters spoke with refinement, dressed modestly but elegantly, and most importantly, they paid in full, in advance, with silver bars from a private mint. But it wasn't money that bought the town's silence. It was strategy. The Everharts understood power dynamics in a way no man in Silver Creek ever could. They knew how to make a threat invisible. They didn't fight for control. They accepted it, made it look like it had always belonged to them. Within weeks, they had employed 6 local women, hired 2 carpenters to renovate the interior, hosted dinner for the foreman's wives, donated lace to the church, even paid the schoolteachers overdue rent. To the outside world, they were benefactors, cultured, educated, civilizing forces in a brutal town. But inside the Golden Rose, shadows were taking chateaus. Rooms were being padded for soundproofing. Locks were installed on the inside of bedroom doors. The cellar was expanded and reinforced. A back entrance hidden behind false crates was constructed for discreet deliveries. And then came the advertisements. Carefully worded, targeted, planted in newspapers across Carson City, Sacramento, even as far as Salt Lake, promising employment for respectable young women. Room, board, safety, escape. What they were really offering was a one-way trip into a house where no one ever left whole, or left at all. The first to vanish was Maria Fernandez. 19, Mexican-American, a daughter, a sister, a lifeline to her crumbling family in Carson City. She arrived with hope in her chest and a promise in her pocket, a letter signed by Margot Everhart, offering steady work, fair wages, and dignity. Dignity. That's what she wanted. That's what the Everharts knew how to exploit. Maria was perfect. Her parents were struggling. Her father picked up labor work when he could, and her mother was sick, consuming what little money they scraped together. Maria had 4 younger siblings and no prospects. When the ad appeared in the Carson City Daily Appeal, her priest helped her respond. A handwritten letter, careful Spanish, clear intentions, hope bleeding through every word. The response came fast. Margot's reply was warm, reassuring, strategically crafted. She praised Maria's character, emphasized the importance of trust, discretion, and loyalty. She described the Golden Rose as a sanctuary for working women in a lawless land. She offered $4 a week, room, board, security. Maria left home with her mother's blessing and her father's worry. She was met, just as promised, at Heinrich Muller's general store by a smiling Adelaide, taken through the town, given a tour, then led into the Golden Rose and into oblivion. The first few weeks, Maria's letters home were full of gratitude. Her room was clean, the sisters were kind, the food was rich, her work manageable, cleaning, cooking, serving meals to the few women allowed upstairs. She said she felt safe. But then came the shift. Her letters thinned, her tone changed. She described being moved from her bright upstairs room to a quiet, more suitable space in the basement. She was told it was temporary. Adelaide began asking strange questions about Maria's family, her siblings, whether anyone would expect her to write often. Wilhelmina reduced her correspondence to once every 2 weeks, claimed the postage was interfering with bookkeeping. In her final letter, Maria mentioned the sounds: scraping, dragging, crying. At night, she was told it was rats. She was never seen again. When her father made the 3-day trip to Silver Creek, the sisters smiled, lied, and handed him a forged note. Maria, they said, had taken a better job in San Francisco. They even produced her farewell letter, coffee-stained, wrinkled, and cold. And just like that, she became the first number in a nightmare that would soon rise to 97. Maria was not a mistake. She was a trial run, a controlled variable, a test of how cleanly they could erase a woman, how easily a town would look the other way, and Silver Creek passed that test with flying colors. No search party, no missing person posters, no telegrams sent to neighboring cities, just a few murmurs at the general store and a quiet nod from the postmaster who said, "She probably found something better." The Everhart sisters had tapped into something ancient. The world doesn't really care when poor girls disappear, especially not immigrant girls, especially not in a town built on extraction, where human value was measured in awe, obedience, and silence. So they expanded. By winter of 1870, the Golden Rose had recruited 4 more women, 2 Irish girls from a Boston orphanage, a half-Creek teenager from Oklahoma Territory, and a German seamstress who arrived with trembling hands and no family name. None of them lasted 6 months. The pattern was always the same. Letters home, positive, hopeful, then strained, then silent. Each disappearance was cloaked in a perfect script, a forged goodbye, a new job, a telegram from a cousin, stories crafted with such consistency that even the skeptical had to wonder if maybe these girls really had just moved on. But they didn't move on. They were moved underground. You see, the Golden Rose wasn't just a brothel, it was a machine, each floor with a function. First floor for appearances, second floor for business, third floor for indoctrination, and beneath it all, the system. The basement wasn't just a storage room, it was a labyrinth, divided into chambers, reinforced with iron brackets, soundproofed with clay and horsehair. They didn't just kill, they studied, tested poisons, observed breakdowns, recorded behavior under deprivation, isolation, sedation. Greta called it the archive. And it gets worse. Because they didn't just bury the bodies, they catalogued them. Each skull tagged, each personal item logged, each girl reduced to an entry in Wilhelmina's black ledger, discovered decades later hidden behind a false wall, page after page of names, dates, methods, and in the margins, notations. Cold, clinical, responded poorly to confinement, promising resilience, terminated early. Subject num 27, compliant but too aware. This wasn't murder for pleasure. This was experimentation for control, and the town never asked a question, because asking questions meant tearing down the illusion, and illusions were what kept them safe. Silver Creek wasn't blind, it was trained, and the Everhart sisters were master trainers. They understood something most people can't bear to admit. You don't have to hide evil, you just have to dress it in ritual, repetition, politeness. If it wears the mask of normal, no one looks underneath. So they engineered a culture of complicity. The sheriff, invited to dinner once a month, Adelaide made sure he left drunk and satisfied, with a few gifts he'd never admit to receiving. The mayor's wife, given a quiet position supervising the girls, along with a generous envelope every week to help with her gambling debts. The local pastor, Greta donated hymnals, robes, and candles to his church, and subtly suggested that too many questions might disturb the harmony of the flock. And it worked perfectly. By early 1871, the Golden Rose wasn't just accepted, it was respected. Local boys dared each other to walk past it at night. Minors fantasized about gaining enough credit to be invited in. The women who worked there, referred to by name in public, but only their first names, as if that kept things clean. The Everhart sisters didn't control Silver Creek with violence. They controlled it with intimacy. They made the town feel like a partner in the lie. Meanwhile, the house itself was evolving. One room was converted into a photographic studio, equipped with chemicals, darkroom, and custom backdrops. Why? Not to take portraits, but to document the archive. Images of subjects in various states, bound, drugged, decomposed. Adelaide oversaw this part herself, keeping glass negatives in a locked iron box beneath the floorboards. Another room became a chamber of voices, a cruel experiment in sound. Recordings made using primitive wax cylinder phonographs, screams, pleas, prayers, played back to incoming girls as part of their breaking process. And still, no one said a word. It's because the deeper the town fell into this shared silence, the more dangerous the truth became. To admit even one death meant admitting the system, the history, the participation. And so, the people of Silver Creek became shadows in their own story, watching girls vanish from their windows, hearing whispers through the walls, and convincing themselves it was just the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was a house feeding on their silence. And the sisters? They were just getting started. By spring of 1872, the Everhart Sisters had turned cruelty into a discipline. No longer content with simple disappearances, they began refining their experiments. And at the heart of it all was Wilhelmina, the oldest, the quietest, the most brilliant, and the most monstrous. She called it the Reconditioning Project. To the outside world, she was a recluse with a limp and a nervous twitch, but behind the locked doors of the Golden Rose's third floor, she ran a program so dark it would later influence early government psychological studies, decades before such practices were formally recognized. She believed that human obedience wasn't inherited, it was installed. Wilhelmina's journals, later found buried in a sealed trunk beneath a rotting floor beam, described the process in horrific detail. Subjects were isolated for days, stripped of names, given numbers, fed identical meals, exposed to curated sounds, wailing babies, buzzing flies, scratching metal, for hours at a time. Then came the submission phase. Loud commands issued at random intervals, punishments doled out for imagined infractions, intermittent kindness, sudden cruelty, a rotating schedule of handlers, so the girls never knew who held power or why. Time became a fog, language started to break, girls would speak in fragments, adopt strange rituals, like counting floorboards or whispering prayers to invisible things. Some called it madness. Wilhelmina called it progress. She charted behavioral changes like a botanist watching petals open. She developed formulas for emotional deterioration. One entry read, Subject number 38 now urinates on command, exhibits signs of attachment to handler B, will test removal tomorrow. Another, subject number 45 attempted suicide with sewing needle, considered a failure, terminated, disposal complete. It wasn't just evil, it was systemic evil, cold, methodical, goal-oriented, and she wasn't working alone. Margot, the youngest and most charming, handled recruitment and performance. She made sure the upstairs rooms remained elegant, mysterious, seductive. The illusion had to be perfect. The air had to feel like luxury, even as screams echoed through the floorboards. Greta, sharp, analytical, managed logistics. She cleaned the ledgers, controlled the flow of laudanum, bribed the delivery boys. She knew who would talk, who wouldn't, and which men could be counted on to protect the sisters at all costs. They weren't witches, they weren't madwomen, they were engineers of psychological ruin. And Silver Creek? It wasn't a town anymore. It was a test site. By the summer of 1872, Silver Creek was no longer a town. It was a mirage held together by superstition, lust, and carefully orchestrated silence. And yet, business was booming. The mines were spitting up silver like vomit from the earth's throat. Men poured in by the dozens each week, hungry, broken, desperate for pleasure. And the Golden Rose had become legendary, not for its luxury, not for its women, but for its secrecy. No one spoke about what went on inside those walls. That was part of the allure. Rumors swirled of blindfolded initiations, black candles, rooms that were never entered twice, but no one asked questions because the ones who did disappeared. Not always violently, not always obviously. A drifter might get a bullet between the ribs behind the stables. A journalist from Reno might vanish en route, his horse found wandering near Black Hollow Ridge with its saddlebag slashed. A teenage boy who peeked through a second-story window might simply go missing. His mother left screaming into the canyon wind, begging a sheriff who wouldn't answer her knock. And yet, No one blamed the sisters. They were untouchable. When a circuit judge rode through and asked why there were no tax records from the brothel, he was gifted a week's stay in the town's finest room and left without filing a single complaint. When a missionary priest attempted to hold a prayer circle outside the Golden Rose, he was found face down in the creek 3 days later, choked on his own rosary beads. No arrests, no trial, just another coincidence. But the worst wasn't what the sisters did. It was what they inspired. Because over time, the townspeople began to change. Wives stopped asking where their husbands went after dark. Children were told not to look toward the rose. The local doctor, once a man of conviction, began prescribing opium not for healing, but for forgetting. Even tea. He barkeep at Stag's Hollow Saloon started serving drinks without eye contact, without words, as if they were all just actors, playing out a script they were afraid to rewrite. It was as though the whole town had been hypnotized, lulled into complicity by wealth, routine, and the constant thrum of whispered threats. Silver Creek wasn't a community anymore. It was a veil pulled over a mass grave. And beneath it, the Everhart Sisters continued their work, uninterrupted. There was one room inside the Golden Rose that even the sisters refused to enter alone. It wasn't part of the main parlor. It wasn't on the guest ledger. It had no windows, no identifying door. But it had a name, the Red Study. And it wasn't for clients. It was for partners. Because by 1873, the Everhart Sisters had built more than a brothel. They had constructed a power hub, a place where secrets could be traded like currency, where guilt could be bought and silence rented by the hour. And inside that velvet-draped room, some of the most powerful men in Nevada sat down to make deals that would never be written and could never be undone. A mining baron named Elias Rowe, known for crushing union threats with pickaxes and bribes, was the first to step inside. He didn't want pleasure. He wanted leverage. He left with photographs, 3 of them, grainy, candlelit, and unmistakable. They showed the district marshal with a tied-up girl who hadn't been seen in over a month. Elias became the sisters' first benefactor. He provided them with men, ones willing to work without questions, ones who knew how to dig and bury and forget. In return, he received not just protection, but insurance. Next came the state auditor, then the telegraph operator, then 2 men from the railroad, faces erased from history, names blacked out in every surviving ledger. The Everharts kept everything: transcripts, drawings, locks of hair, payment logs coded with obscure Latin terms. When a man entered the Red Study, he left behind a part of himself, something he couldn't retrieve, no matter how far he climbed in politics, wealth, or sin. And that's how the sisters became untouchable. Not because they hid from power, but because they housed it. The mayor of Silver Creek stopped calling them madams. He began referring to them as the Silent Council. When a fire burned half the mining district to the ground, relief funds were rerouted at the Everhart's suggestion. When the sheriff's deputy shot a prostitute in broad daylight, the coroner declared it a suicide after being handed a coin pouch stamped with a rose sigil. It wasn't just manipulation. It wasn't just blackmail. It was architecture. The Everhart sisters weren't running from justice. They were feeding it to something deeper. By late 1873, the killings had taken on a pattern. They were no longer random, no longer reactive. They were scheduled. Every 7th Thursday, the Golden Rose would close for maintenance. Lamps were dimmed, curtains drawn. A black feather was nailed to the main door. The sisters said it was to cleanse the air, but no one in Silver Creek believed that. Because by dawn the next day, someone was always gone. Not a client, not a stranger, but one of the girls. And each time the townsfolk told themselves the same lie. She probably left. She found another job. She was never really from here anyway. But behind the black door, something else was happening. The White Room, a 3rd-floor chamber with no furniture, no windows, no color but bone, became the center of what Greta called the quiet preparation. It began with a drug, an old tincture Adelaide claimed was brought from an island off the coast of Louisiana. Mixed with laudanum and bloodroot, it caused the girls to fall into a waking sleep. Still, obedient, eyes wide, but soul removed. And then came the washing. 2 older workers, called the widows, would scrub the girl's skin with goat's milk and ash, comb her hair with bone picks, and paint her lips with crushed berries. Not for beauty, but for passage. They believed the ritual disguised the girl from the one who waits. Then, just before midnight, she would be led, naked, blindfolded, into the rose cellar. No one outside the sisters ever saw what occurred in that room, but those who stood above could hear. The chanting, the dragging of chains, the animal sounds, low, guttural, not quite human. And most horrifying of all, the metallic groan of the cellar door being sealed from within, as if the house itself were alive, participating. By morning, the cellar would be clean. No blood, no bones, no trace, just a fresh coat of salt along the threshold, LD and a single copper coin left at the foot of the stairs. The Everharts never explained the coin, but miners swore it matched the ancient tokens found in the oldest shafts, coins from before Nevada was a territory, before America. Some said it was payment, others said it was tribute, but those closest to the house whispered something worse, that it was an offering, and that whatever they were feeding was still hungry. Her name was Clara Munsley, 16, sold to the Golden Rose by her uncle for 6 silver eagles and a wagon wheel. She arrived in winter of 1874, young, pale, and completely unaware of what the Everharts had built behind those velvet curtains. For her first 2 weeks, she cleaned, never spoke, but on the 3rd week she was moved to the upstairs wing, closer to the rituals. Clara was clever. She never fought, never screamed. She smiled when spoken to and memorized everything, the rotations of the guards, the way the doors clicked, the times when the sisters left to meet their investors. And one night, she ran. She slid a hairpin into the dumbwaiter lock, crawled down into the kitchen pantry, and slipped into the side alley barefoot, carrying only a tin of salted pork and a slip of torn parchment that read, "Do not look at it." Clara didn't make it far. She reached the home of a local laundress named Edna Vickers. Edna took her in, wiped her feet, fed her, and then Clara whispered the things she'd seen. A mirror that showed people already dead. A pool in the basement that didn't reflect faces. A man with no eyes standing at the end of her bed for 3 nights in a row. And one night, while hiding behind a set of wardrobe crates, she saw Greta and Adelaide dragging a limp girl into a false wall behind the wine racks. Clara followed, silent as fog, and peeked through a crack in the boards. What she described defied sanity, an underground chamber filled with bones, dozens, maybe hundreds, stacked in rings, each one marked with symbols written in ash. At the center, a blackened altar carved with names in reverse Latin, and around it, 9 chairs. Only 8 were ever filled. Clara never saw the 9th guest, only heard breathing, heavy, low, wet. Edna didn't believe her, until 2 nights later, when she found her dog eviscerated on the front porch, its innards arranged into a spiral. By the time the town marshal was summoned, Clara was gone. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, just a trail of small wet footprints leading back toward the Golden Rose. The Everharts claimed they'd never seen her, but later Edna received a package, no return address. Inside was a copper coin and Clara's hair ribbon, tied in a noose. By spring of 1874, Silver Creek had changed. Not in appearance. On the surface, it still looked like a mining town. Dust-covered boots, rusted tin roofs, tired hands exchanging dirty dollars. But beneath it all, something had shifted. You could see it in the way the town marshal started turning away from reports, the way the preacher skipped entire chapters of scripture, especially anything about the whore of Babylon, the way the doctor began prescribing laudanum to women who simply spoke of bad dreams. You see, Greta and Adelaide weren't just madams. They were engineers. designing a structure of fear, silence, and loyalty, brick by brick. And the first brick was always debt. The Golden Rose offered loans to miners and merchants alike. Quick money, no questions asked. But the repayment, it wasn't always in dollars. Sometimes it was labor, sometimes it was silence, and sometimes it was your daughter. It started with the sheriff. His son had a habit of taking whiskey from the freight cars. Instead of arrest, Greta offered correction. Within a week, the sheriff's wife was hosting tea inside the brothel, and no one ever saw her leave angry. Next was the banker. He embezzled to cover his gambling debts. Adelaide gave him a ledger with different numbers and told him, "Smile in public. We'll keep your secrets." Even the priest fell. A man named Father Bertram, stoic, grey-bearded, always quoting Revelation. One Sunday he gave a sermon about Jezebel and women who lead men to ruin. The next week his church caught fire, not from the outside but from the pulpit inward. When the flames were put out, only one thing remained untouched, the stained glass window of Mary Magdalene, except her eyes were missing. And above the ash-covered altar, written in soot, "She was never a whore, you just needed her to be." From that day on, Father Bertram was seen dining with Greta every Thursday. So, the people of Silver Creek learned. They learned that justice had a price, that truth could be erased with enough coin, or fear. They learned to look away, to keep their heads down, to tell themselves stories about wild girls and accidents and God's mysterious ways. But deep down, they knew. Silver Creek wasn't a town anymore. It was a theater. And the Everhart Sisters were writing the script. There were still a few who didn't bow, men and women who remembered when Silver Creek had backbone, when wrong was wrong, and when girls didn't vanish in velvet silence. One of them was Thomas Finch. A former Union scout turned surveyor, Finch had a sharp mind and a sharper instinct for buried things, whether it be coal veins or corruption. He kept records, names, dates, girls who entered but never left. He logged when the shipments of black candles arrived from New Orleans. He noted that the Golden Rose always closed its doors on the 13th of every month, no matter what. He wasn't quiet about it either. In Town Square, he read his findings aloud, accused the sisters of trafficking, murder, witchcraft. The townsfolk just stared at their boots. That night, Finch's home burned to the ground. But here's the thing. They found him nailed to the barn wall, still alive, throat slit, but eyes wide open. Scratched into the blood-soaked boards beside him were just two words: "We see." The second to challenge the Everharts was Miriam Doss, a midwife and herbalist. She claimed to have treated 7 young girls from the Rose who all bore the same strange symptoms: eyes that wouldn't close, tongues that turned black, and dreams of being watched through mirrors. Miriam sent letters, east to Charleston, west to Denver, begging for intervention, for inquiry, for someone to come look. None ever arrived. But 3 weeks later, her goat gave birth to a stillborn kid with human teeth. Her well turned thick. Her skin began to peel like she'd been scalded from the inside out. They found her in the chapel ruins, naked, eyes sewn shut, with pages from a Bible stuffed into her mouth. But the Bible had been rewritten, every verse altered, words twisted. God didn't speak in it. Something else did. Others followed, quietly, then quickly. Jonah Pexley, the telegraph operator, disappeared ID sentence during a transmission to county police. Widow Mabel Kearns was found hanging upside down in her attic, her body drained. 2 children who whispered about screams from the brothel cellar were found drowned in the livestock trough, smiling. One by one, every questioner was silenced. Not just by death, but by design. Because the Everhart Sisters didn't just kill you, they unwrote you. No tombstone, no newspaper notice, no whisper of your name in church, only silence. And silence is where monsters thrive. Beneath the polished wood floors of the Golden Rose, past the velvet hallways and perfumed masks, lay the cellar. Not a wine cellar, not a storage room, but a chamber, cut deep into the bedrock beneath Silver Creek, older than the brothel itself. The door to it, hidden behind a mirror in Greta's personal parlor, a mirror that wasn't nailed but bolted with iron and salt, and only Greta had the key worn around her neck, a silver locket filled with a curl of someone else's hair. Those who managed to glimpse the chamber, before they vanished, spoke of symbols carved into the stone in a language no scholar could place, not Latin, not Greek, something older. There were chains, not for prisoners, but for offerings. In the center stood a basin, black as pitch, yet it reflected no light. It said when blood was poured into it, faces rose from its surface, contorted, gasping, as if trying to scream, but held under water. They called it the mouth, and the sisters spoke to it. But they never spoke in English. They sang, low, rhythmic tones that made the air thicken, words that slid across your spine like wet insects, and as they sang, the basin pulsed, like a heart. It wasn't just a ritual, it was a transaction. Each girl who disappeared, each woman broken, each scream muffled behind satin walls, it all fed the mouth. The cellar wasn't a grave, it was an engine. What did they get in return? That's harder to say. But Adelaide never aged. Greta's wounds, gunshot, blade, burn, healed overnight. And those who looked into the sisters' eyes too long forgot their own names. There was one man who claimed to have entered the cellar and escaped. A vagrant named Elijah Rook. He wandered into town one winter, rambling about the black pool and the voices from under the dirt. He said he saw children's hands reaching from the basin, said he saw a woman made of smoke and bow, walk out of the stone wall and kiss Greta on the lips. He said the stone floor bled when they sang. No one believed him, until he ripped his own eyes out during a sermon. Screaming, "She's inside the mirror, and she knows my name." After that, the cellar was never spoken of again, but the sisters kept singing, and the mouth? It was always hungry. By 1881, Silver Creek was no longer the same town. Its streets were quiet but not peaceful. Windows stayed shuttered in daylight, candles burned at noon, children spoke less, churches emptied, and every dog within a mile of the Golden Rose stopped barking. Something had changed, not just inside the brothel but outside it. The land soured, crops grew twisted, corn with blood-colored kernels, tomatoes that oozed bile, wells filled with water that shimmered strangely in the moonlight and tasted like iron and tears. Livestock miscarried in droves, chickens laid eggs filled with black feathers, cows birthed calves without eyes, and the air itself took on a weight, thick, heavy, like someone breathing against your skin at all times. Then came the sleepwalkers. It started with just one girl, Renee Clark, age 9. She was found barefoot in the church graveyard, face turned toward the brothel, muttering, "The ladies want us to dance." She had no memory of it in the morning, but the next week it was 5 more. Children, old men, even a schoolteacher, all found wandering at dusk, eyes glazed, hands outstretched like they were being pulled by invisible strings, each one whispering a variation of the same thing. They sing beneath the dirt. They need more voices. They're building a house that moves. The doctor diagnosed it as mass hysteria. But when he started hearing the singing himself through his floorboards in his walls, he hanged himself in his study with a rosary and left a note that read, "She came through the keyhole." Worse still were the mirrors. People started covering them, smashing them, because in Silver Creek your reflection didn't always match your movements. Sometimes it blinked late. Sometimes it smiled when you didn't. Sometimes it kept watching after you walked away. Entire families left in the night, not for fear of gossip, a scandal, but for survival. And those who stayed, they changed. They spoke less, slept less, hoped less, as if something in the soil had eaten their will. The Golden Rose no longer needed to lure victims. The town itself had become an open throat, and the sisters, they watched it all from their balcony, dressed in black, drinking something thick from crystal goblets, toasting the rot they'd birthed, and smiling. By late 1881, time itself began to crack. It started subtly. A man would leave his home at sunrise and arrive at his shop before unlocking the door, already inside. Women reported sewing the same hem 4, 5, 6 times, as if the thread unraveled itself between blinks. Then came the echoes. People claimed to hear conversations they hadn't yet had, arguments that hadn't happened, laughter that turned to sobs before a word was spoken. The blacksmith's son ran screaming from his room, yelling about a voice that whispered the future in reverse. He claimed it was Greta's, that she had told him the date of his mother's death, and that it was tomorrow. She died the next day, choked on a bone during supper. No one touched the stew after that. And the disappearances grew stranger. Not just girls from other towns, but townsfolk themselves. Whole families. The Hooper family vanished during Sunday lunch, plates still steaming, a chair knocked over, the baby's rattle left rocking on the floor. Only the dog remained. It had no eyes, but it stayed sitting by the door, tail wagging, like the family might still return. The mayor called in men from Louisville, scientists, surveyors, clergymen. They came armed with Bibles, cameras, compasses, but they never made it to the brothel. They ended up in the wrong places. One team found themselves standing in a swamp 6 miles east, though they swore they were still on Main Street. Another man opened his notebook and saw pages filled with a handwriting not his own, scrawling, "They opened it. Now it wants everything back." The priest, Father Mallory, made it furthest. He got inside. Witnesses say he walked straight into the Golden Rose holding a crucifix and chanting in Latin. He lasted 10 minutes. Came out screaming, clothes shredded, hair white, eyes bleeding. He kept repeating, "The rose has no roots. It floats. It feeds. It remembers." Then he bit off his own tongue and collapsed. The Everhart Sisters, untouched, unbothered. Their brothel, untouched by flame, flood, or rot, stood pristine amidst the crumbling town, and late at night people saw strange lights in the sky over the brothel. Not stars, not lanterns. Lights that moved like they were searching. Some said the Everharts weren't feeding on the town anymore. They were calling something to it, something older than time, and it was answering. By early 1882, memory began to rot in Silver Creek. Not just dates or names, entire lives vanished from the minds of those who lived them. Parents couldn't recall their children's birth dates. Husbands stared at their wives like strangers. Men swore they never built their own homes, even while standing inside them. And worse, people began forgetting the dead, not mourning them, not speaking of them in whispers, just forgetting they ever existed. Graves in the churchyard stood nameless. Tombstones cracked in half overnight. The town's single record book, containing every birth, death, and wedding since 1810, was found with pages torn out. Others smeared in ink, like someone had tried to erase names with their bare hands. And then, the dead came back. Not all of them, not at once, but enough to make people doubt their own reality. Mrs. Kettle swore her son Jonah had died in the war. She had buried him with her own hands. She wore his dog tags around her neck. Then one day, Jonah was in her kitchen, sitting at the table, drinking coffee, saying he'd never left. She screamed. The neighbors heard it, but by the time they arrived, she was sitting calmly across from him, eyes glassy, lips smiling. She called him, "my sweet boy," but her dog wouldn't stop barking at him, until it keeled over, dead. Elsewhere, old lovers showed up at doorsteps with new names. Long-lost sisters appeared in mirrors. People who were once kind turned cruel. People who once feared the Everharts began defending them. Even the land itself changed. Maps no longer matched reality. Paths led nowhere. A man could leave town and walk for hours, only to end up back at the Golden Rose, knees blistered, lips cracked, weeping in terror. He swore he followed the river. There was no river near Silver Creek. Not anymore. The sisters had stitched something new into the town's skin, an infectie, on of identity. A rewriting of truth. They weren't just feeding on souls anymore. They were harvesting reality, and no one could stop them, because no one could remember what reality was. Not the mayor, not the preacher, not the doctor, and certainly not the people who still walked past the brothel at night, drawn by music that only they could hear. a waltz made of lost names and false memories, played for dancers who had already died. By the spring of 1882, something shifted. The veil between truth and delusion thinned, and in that bleeding crack, remorse crawled in. Not everyone, but enough to remember what they'd allowed. Because Silver Creek hadn't just been a victim of the Everhart Sisters, it had been their partner. For decades, the townsfolk knew what happened behind the walls of the Golden Rose. They saw the bruised girls, the ones who arrived hopeful and left hollow, or never left at all. They saw the wagons hauling linen out to the woods. They heard screams they swore were the wind. And they did nothing. No, worse. They profited. Merchants sold the sisters silk and lace at half price. Farmers delivered food for free in exchange for company. The sheriff turned his gaze west every night, because silence paid better than justice. Silver Creek didn't just tolerate the Everharts, it fed them. And now, the hunger had turned inward. The brothel didn't need outsiders anymore, it was feeding on its own. Children born in town began speaking in tongues, languages never taught, filled with sounds that made dogs whimper and crows fall from the sky. One girl, Clara Jennings, stared at her newborn brother and whispered, "He's not ours, he's theirs now." She was 3. The doctor tried to leave, packed his bags, hitched a horse, rode east until dawn. He was found in the cemetery at noon, every tooth pulled from his mouth, his lips sewn shut with braid from a woman's hair. A symbol was carved into his chest, not one the priest recognized, but one the Everharts wore around their necks, branded into gold, shaped like a thorn-wrapped womb. The town tried to rise up, a secret meeting at the schoolhouse, torches, guns, a plan to burn the brothel to ash. Only 3 men showed up. One was blind by morning, one walked into the river that night and never came up, and the third, he married Loretta Everhart. A week later, he strangled his mother in her sleep and carved the phrase, "The rose blooms beneath skin," into her bed frame, with her ribs. Silver Creek was past salvation, because in trying to destroy the curse, they remembered too much, and some truths, once unearthed, don't forgive. They consume. You were told there were 3 Everhart sisters, Loretta, Maud, June. But that was never true. There were always more. Some in the walls, some in the mirrors, some wearing skin borrowed from girls who vanished on their way to Charleston or Lexington, some just voices, whispers in the attics, lullabies in reverse, footsteps that never matched their owners. Because the Everharts were not born. They were made. Forged. In 1811, long before the brothel ever opened, a preacher named Amos Tolliver arrived in Silver Creek. He didn't carry a Bible. He carried a book made of black vellum, stitched together from the hides of 13 marked women, branded as whores, hung as witches, buried in secret by midwives who wept even as they cursed them. This preacher wasn't sent by God. He came to birth something. Inside the hollowed-out foundations of what would become the Golden Rose, Amos Tolliver drew a circle, sacrificed a lamb, a child, a mute man, mixed their blood with dirt taken from a battlefield soaked in betrayal, and from that pit came the sisters. Naked, fully grown, eyes wide with recognition, they did not speak. They sang. A single note, so high it split bark from trees and burst the heart of a fox that wandered too close. He named them Everhart, meaning always hunger, not for flesh, but for reality. The first women lured into their house didn't die. They became mirrors, hosts, vessels for more sisters to enter the world. It was never a brothel, it was a temple. A place where identity could be rewritten, memory could be fed upon, and God's rules could be reversed. That's why no one could remember. That's why the town twisted itself around them. That's why girls still arrived, even when warnings were whispered in every tavern from Kentucky to Ohio. Because the ritual demands pilgrims. The sisters weren't seducing. They were summoning. And every time a man crossed their threshold, he didn't just sin, he offered a piece of the world's logic as tribute. until the town no longer obeyed time, until gravity bent in the halls of the rose, until love turned to knives and memory to ash, until truth had no shape left at all. October 31st, 1882. The sky bled orange, the trees twisted, no birds, no dogs barking, just silence, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. A stranger arrived, no name, no horse, no shadow. He walked barefoot down the main street, past the post office, the chapel, the hollow houses that once held laughter, now gutted by dread. In his hand, a torch. In his other, a pouch filled with white ash and teeth. He said only one thing to the sheriff before heading toward the brothel. They were never meant to be this strong. At exactly midnight, the torch touched the door of the Golden Rose. The flames didn't rise. They sank, pulled downward like water down a drain, disappearing into the floorboards, vanishing into the roots of the land, as if the house itself was swallowing fire to feed something below. The sisters stepped out onto the porch, unburned, unmoving, smiling. Except they weren't just three. The faces flickered, multiplied. A dozen forms, cycling like a broken zoetrope. Old women, children, men, corpses, versions of people who had died long ago. The Everhart Sisters were everyone the town had forgotten. They whispered a final blessing. We were not born of sin. We are sin given spine. And then, finally, the brothel did catch fire. But not like wood burns, like memory burns. Suddenly, the townspeople forgot their names. They couldn't remember the face of their children. Men wept at their own reflections. Mothers fled into the woods, clutching dolls as if they were infants. The fire spread through thought, not timber, and by dawn, Silver Creek was gone. The land still existed, the trees still stood, but maps no longer showed it. Trains no longer stopped there, and people who tried to speak of it forgot what they were saying halfway through. The stranger? He vanished, his pouch of ash and teeth found hanging from the church steeple, dripping something black that stained the stone permanently. The Golden Rose. It's still there. But only at dusk. Only for those with secrets so dark they shine. Some say you can hear the sisters singing if you drive far enough into rural Kentucky, past the towns that don't answer mail and don't hang flags. Their voices don't age. They just wait. Because hunger like that is eternal. They called it the Golden Rose, but behind those velvet curtains bloomed something far more sinister. The Everhart Sisters didn't just run a brothel, they buried 90 women beneath it. And yet, no charges were ever filed, no justice was ever served. So ask yourself, how many more secrets like this still rot beneath the soil of American history? Subscribe before the next story is erased forever.